Hey everyone, it's Pastor Allen here. I'm dressed for Fort Stevenson Frontier Days. If you got time this Sunday, come on down to Fort Stevenson and enjoy the day with us. It's a wonderful experience. Starts at noon on Sunday, so we'd love to have you come down and enjoy the state park there. It's a wonderful experience, and I know you'll enjoy it. I would like to invite you to share with me this last message in my series. It's on beginnings, and it comes from the book of Genesis. One of the toughest areas for us to deal with in our lives is our concept of faith. I kind of grew up in camp and going to church camps, and I remember having many of our speakers, and later on when I was a jaded camp counselor and worker, I also can remember hearing our camp speakers talk about having radical faith and some other ideas that they never really clearly defined. And I remember as a camper thinking that radical faith had something to do with doing something really wild or crazy or different or unusual or strange or even quite rebellious or possibly even very reckless. And I thought about all of that in relationship to what faith really is and what having a reckless Christian faith is all about. I've entitled this particular message, Wood and Fire. And it comes out of Genesis chapter 22, verses 7 through 13. However, I'll be using the entire backdrop of the chapter for my particular thoughts. During the late 1500s up through the early 1700s, an interesting subject for paintings began to be used widely among the painters during this time that is post-Reformation, early Enlightenment period is what it's technically known as in historical terms. But it talks about a period of time when there were religious wars going on. Science was beginning to develop as a discipline and as a concept within Western society. And it also was a time of Renaissance ideas of painting had come to fruition. And during that period of time, particularly the Dutch masters became quite interested in Old Testament themes, but not just the traditional ones like David and Goliath. They became interested in themes from Genesis. Particularly, one of the themes was Genesis chapter 22, the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. In that particular experience, there are a lot of questions that come up in their paintings, and many of them have very unique and different approaches to that particular story. But the story itself is quite troubling. It's troubling because of what God asks of Abraham. It is troubling because of how Abraham approaches things. It's troubling because of the results that apparently come out of this experience. Radical faith very often requires of us a commitment to God's purpose and plan that we don't always understand or see on the front end. And that is profound to me in one sense, because Abraham was not a man that we would have thought of as being daring or outside of the boundaries. Of course, he went to a land that he did not know. He followed God in his purpose no matter what in his life, but Abraham was never asked to do anything particularly radical until this moment by God. The writer of Hebrews will identify this moment as one of the profound moments in Abraham's faith walk with God. And I've always wondered about that, because the story is almost eerie when you read it in Genesis. You have Abraham meeting with God and God saying, I want to prove your faith. How much are you willing to follow me? I'm going to ask that you take your son Isaac and sacrifice him to me. I want you to go to the mountain that I will show you, and I want you to go there with the purpose of sacrificing your son and heir. Now, we think of Isaac as being a very young child at this point, but the word that is used for him is the word lad. And the Hebrew word that stands behind that generally indicates a young man in his teens. And it indicates to us that this young man was likely in his early teens at this point. We do know that he is strong enough to carry a load of wood. And so that means that he has to have physically developed to that point in his life. Abraham certainly at plus 100 is not going to be in the condition to carry those kinds of weight himself. They bring with them wood and fire. And in verse 7, it kind of focuses the whole scenario for us, because in verse 7, Isaac turns to his father when they are preparing to leave their servants for the last day's journey to Mount Moriah. He looks at his father and says, "We have fire and we have wood, but where is the sacrifice?" It is a profound moment, and it is eerie with its question and its suggestion of the moment. Now, if you follow the rest of the story, God stays the hand of Abraham from killing his son Isaac and blesses him because of his radical faith. But at the beginning of the incident, Abraham doesn't know that God will stop him from this terrible deed. The writer of Hebrews indicates that instead Abraham has faith that even if he has to kill his son, God will resurrect Isaac. It is a strange moment where faith and commitment and trust all come together. It is hard to understand what the impact of this whole experience was on Isaac. We can guess a little bit at the impact on Sarah, because when they arrived home, I'm sure all of this information came out. And Sarah, if you look at the beginning of chapter 23 at her death, Sarah is living apart from Abraham. Abraham is living in the city of Beersheba, around the city of Beersheba, which is about 30 miles away from where Sarah is living, near what is now the modern city of Hebron. They are 2 days apart in journey, and it appears that Isaac spends most of his time with his mother, Sarah. In fact, their relationship grows very, very close. Sometimes when God has called us to a radical decision of faith, it requires us to understand that not everyone is going to understand, or are they going to follow along with that action of faith. Abraham is caught in that dilemma. I'm sure he would have liked for his wife and his son to understand. But to be honest with you, when God has called upon us for an act of faith, not everyone will understand it. Not everyone will perceive that it's a good decision. Jesus would say to his disciples, "You must lift up your cross and carry it and follow after me." He goes on to define that by saying, to do that, you must count the cost of what it means to follow, to have radical faith. Radical faith is not about doing something rebellious. It is instead about being committed to the will and the purpose of God no matter what. Abraham was willing to be committed to the will and the purpose of God no matter what God asked of him. Now that seems strange to us because the last time we see Abraham prior to this event, he is angry with God. God has asked him to send his son Ishmael away at Sarah's request. And so Abram is angry and frustrated with God, and it shows in his treatment of Ishmael and Hagar, which even Jewish authorities recognize as being inappropriate for Abraham's behavior. But Abraham, after that, if you will allow me, adult temper tantrum, comes to this point in chapter 22. And he and God have been reconciled in the process. He has counted the cost and determines that God's character and God's willingness to promise is worth the risk of faith. Is radical faith in your life worth the risk? Is it worth the risk of saying yes to God? That's what radical faith really is. It's saying yes to God. I trust you. I trust your character. I believe that you will do what you have said you will do. I hope your faith is radical today, that you're willing to pick up your cross and follow after Christ, that you're willing to be his disciple no matter what. God bless you. Hope to see you in church. Take care. And if I don't see you in church, I hope to see you out at Fort Stevenson. Take care.